Sometimes, the moment that breaks a marriage isn't a betrayal, a screaming match, or a dramatic confession. Sometimes, it's a new phone sitting silently in someone's hands. Daniel had spent $76,000 on it for his wife, Emily, because her old flip phone had begun malfunctioning. He wasn't expecting a celebration. He wasn't looking for praise. After years of marriage, he had learned not to expect much. But he thought she might at least smile. Instead, Emily looked at the phone with an expression that barely changed. Daniel asked what was wrong. Her answer was simple. Why should there be excitement? I don't have a flip anymore anyway. Daniel stood there quietly. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He simply looked at the woman he had spent years trying to make happy. And something inside him finally shifted. Because suddenly, the phone didn't matter. The $76,000 didn't matter. What mattered was the realization that had been sitting just beneath the surface for years. Daniel had been working harder and harder, believing that one day, if he could just solve enough problems, provide enough money, make enough sacrifices, Emily would finally feel happy. But what if that day was never coming? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Daniel's exhaustion wasn't caused by one argument or one disappointing reaction. It had been building through years of decisions, compromises, and promises that somehow never seemed to be enough. And as he stood there looking at Emily, he began asking himself a question he had avoided for far too long. Had he spent years trying to fix a problem that couldn't be fixed by money, patience, or effort? To understand why that question mattered so much, we have to go back to the decision that changed everything. A decision Daniel once believed was necessary for their future. A decision Emily would later blame for destroying hers. The move. For Daniel, providing for his family had never been something he took lightly. He was the kind of man who measured love in responsibility. Bills paid on time. A safer home. A better car. A future with fewer financial worries. He wasn't perfect, and he knew that. But whenever life became difficult, his instinct was always the same: find a solution and keep moving. Emily was different. She was intelligent, capable, and once deeply ambitious about her own career. When they married, neither of them expected their lives to become this complicated. They had talked about careers, money, a home, and the kind of future they wanted to build together. For a while, it seemed like they were moving in the same direction. Then Daniel received an opportunity that could change everything. A job in another city came with a significantly better salary, enough to make a real difference in their finances and help them handle the debts and commitments they had taken on together. But there was a cost. Emily would have to leave her career behind and start again somewhere unfamiliar. Daniel knew that wasn't a small sacrifice. So he asked her. Then he asked again. And again. Over the weeks that followed, he repeatedly tried to understand whether she wanted him to accept the offer. But Emily never gave him a clear yes. She never gave him a clear no, either. Eventually, Daniel made the decision. He accepted the job and prepared for the move. In his mind, this wasn't a decision he had forced on his wife. It was a difficult choice they had discussed, one he believed was necessary for the future they were trying to build. But Emily would remember that period differently. And that difference would become one of the deepest fractures in their marriage. Because years later, whenever their lives felt unhappy, Emily would return to the same accusation: Daniel had moved them, and in doing so, he had ruined her career. Daniel couldn't understand it. He remembered the questions. He remembered waiting for an answer. He remembered believing they were choosing their future together. But there was something he hadn't understood yet. Sometimes two people can live through the exact same decision and walk away with completely different memories of what happened. And for Daniel and Emily, that disagreement was only the first layer of a much larger problem. Before long, Daniel would discover that moving cities hadn't solved their problems. It had simply given them a new place to begin. The move was supposed to be the beginning of a better life. Instead, it became the place where Daniel and Emily's marriage began changing in ways neither of them fully understood. Daniel settled into his new job, and financially, things started moving in the direction he had hoped. The larger paycheck meant they could breathe a little easier. Bills were more manageable. Their financial plans seemed more realistic. From Daniel's perspective, the sacrifice had been worth it. But Emily's career was a different story. The opportunity she had once imagined for herself didn't follow her to the new city. Months passed, and she still hadn't found a new direction. Daniel could see that she was unhappy, so he did what he always did when something went wrong: he tried to solve it. He offered to hire a cook. Then a maid. He wanted Emily to have as much free time as possible to focus entirely on finding another job. He helped prepare her resume, searched for openings, encouraged her to create and use a LinkedIn profile, and repeatedly asked what kind of work she actually wanted. He even told her that if she preferred to stay home, he would accept that too. But nothing seemed to change. Emily didn't take the opportunities Daniel placed in front of her. And whenever the subject came up, the conversation somehow returned to the same accusation: Daniel had ruined her career. To him, it made no sense. He had asked for her opinion before accepting the job. He had tried to make the transition easier. He had offered practical support and even removed the pressure for her to work. Yet the resentment remained. And slowly, Daniel began to wonder whether he was dealing with a problem that couldn't be solved by another job application, another household expense, or another attempt to make life easier. Because what if Emily wasn't rejecting his solutions because she didn't want a solution? What if he was simply trying to solve the wrong problem? There was something about the move that Daniel still didn't understand. Something Emily had never fully explained. And years later, that unanswered part of their story would become impossible for either of them to ignore. By the time Daniel and Emily had settled into their new city, the biggest problems in their marriage were no longer happening outside the house. They were happening inside it, in moments so ordinary that neither of them could explain how they kept turning into arguments. A towel left in the wrong basket could become a disagreement. Something moved from its usual place could trigger frustration. A simple household rule could become the beginning of another fight. Daniel started feeling as though he had to think carefully before touching anything, saying anything, or doing anything around the house. The place that was supposed to be where he could finally relax began feeling more like a place where he was constantly waiting to make another mistake. Sometimes, after an argument over something that seemed insignificant, Daniel would sit quietly and ask himself the same question: how did we get here? But there was another part of their marriage that made the distance between them even harder to ignore. Their physical intimacy had essentially disappeared. Emily was dealing with a medical condition that made intimacy extremely difficult, and Daniel understood that it wasn't something she had simply chosen. He paid for medical treatment. He supported therapy and appointments. He tried to remain patient because he knew that her condition wasn't her fault. But patience didn't mean the situation was emotionally easy. As the months passed, Daniel found himself carrying the frustration, loneliness, and uncertainty of a marriage that no longer felt like the partnership he had imagined. He wasn't angry at Emily for having a medical condition. What exhausted him was everything surrounding it: the arguments, the distance, the unresolved resentment, and the feeling that every attempt to make things better somehow led to another conflict. Slowly, Daniel began believing that he was carrying the marriage almost entirely by himself. He was working. He was paying the bills. He was arranging treatment. He was trying to solve problems. And yet, somehow, he still felt like the person failing Emily. But there was something Daniel hadn't considered. What if Emily didn't see herself as the person being carried? What if, from her side of the marriage, she believed she had been carrying something too? And if that was true, then the story Daniel had been telling himself for years was missing a crucial piece. By this point, Daniel and Emily were living inside the same marriage, but they were no longer living inside the same story. Daniel looked back at the move and saw a decision he had tried repeatedly to make with Emily. He remembered the conversations, the questions, and the uncertainty. In his mind, he had given her choices. Emily remembered something very different. To her, the choice had already been made long before Daniel accepted the job. She had watched the financial pressures surrounding them, understood what the larger salary could mean, and felt that saying no could make her responsible for destroying their future. So while Daniel remembered asking, "Are you okay with this?" Emily remembered feeling that there was only one acceptable answer. That difference mattered because Daniel believed he had moved them so they could build a better life. Emily believed the move had cost her the life she had already built. And neither memory was necessarily a complete picture. Daniel wasn't deliberately trying to destroy her career. Emily wasn't necessarily refusing opportunity simply because she wanted to remain unhappy. There was something deeper attached to the career she had left behind. It wasn't just a paycheck. It represented independence, identity, confidence, and a version of herself she had worked hard to become. That was why every conversation about the move seemed to reopen the same wound. Daniel kept offering practical solutions because he saw a practical problem. Emily kept returning to the loss because, from her perspective, the real damage had already happened. To Daniel, the solution was another job. To Emily, the problem was everything she believed she had sacrificed to get there. And this changed the way the audience had to see their marriage. Perhaps Emily wasn't simply refusing to move forward. Perhaps she was still trying to make Daniel understand what she believed had been taken from her. The question now wasn't whether Daniel had offered enough solutions. It was whether he had ever understood what Emily actually needed from him. And Daniel was about to discover that her deepest resentment might have very little to do with the career itself. Daniel kept trying. That had become his instinct whenever something in the marriage wasn't working. If Emily was struggling with her career, he searched for opportunities and helped with applications. If the workload at home was overwhelming, he offered to bring in a cook and a maid. If money was the source of pressure, he worked harder and focused on financial security. When Emily needed medical care, Daniel paid for treatment, supported therapy, and helped with appointments. On paper, he was doing everything he believed a husband could reasonably do. Yet Emily remained unhappy. And eventually, that began to wear Daniel down in a way he couldn't easily explain. He started keeping a mental record of everything he had tried, not because he wanted applause, but because he genuinely couldn't understand what else he was supposed to do. He had spent years treating his wife's unhappiness like a problem with a solution. Find the right job. Remove the household burden. Improve the finances. Support the treatment. Be patient. Try again. But there was a problem with that approach. Some forms of unhappiness don't disappear simply because the circumstances around them improve. And Daniel was beginning to discover that money could pay a bill, but it couldn't repair resentment. A maid could clean a house, but she couldn't settle an old argument. A new opportunity could open a door, but it couldn't restore a sense of identity someone believed they had lost. Then Daniel started noticing something that unsettled him. Emily didn't seem unhappy only when something went wrong. Sometimes, she seemed unhappy when things were going right. The bills were being handled. The household was more comfortable. He was still working hard. Yet the tension remained. The pattern forced Daniel to consider a possibility he had avoided for years. Maybe the resentment hadn't started with the latest argument. Maybe it had been there much earlier, quietly shaping the way Emily saw their marriage and every decision they made together. And if that was true, Daniel had been spending years trying to repair the visible damage without ever discovering where the first crack had appeared. By now, the arguments had stopped feeling like isolated incidents and started feeling like part of the structure of a marriage. A disagreement would begin over something small, grow into something much larger, and eventually end in silence. Then the silence would last long enough for both Daniel and Emily to retreat into their own versions of what had happened. Daniel became more emotionally withdrawn. Emily became more resentful. And with every argument, they seemed to become less capable of giving each other the benefit of the doubt. A simple question from Daniel could sound like criticism to Emily. An attempt to help could feel like control. Something Emily said out of frustration could sound to Daniel like another accusation. The strange part was that neither person necessarily had to be lying for the marriage to become this damaged. They were simply experiencing the same moments through completely different emotional lenses. Daniel might remember offering help, while Emily remembered being pressured. Emily might remember expressing frustration, while Daniel remembered being attacked. Each believed the other was failing to understand what was happening. And because neither felt understood, both became increasingly defensive. Eventually, even ordinary conversations carried a history behind them. A sentence wasn't just a sentence anymore. It carried the memory of previous arguments, previous disappointments, and previous attempts that had failed. So they started avoiding the conversations that mattered most. Why reopen an issue if it would only become another fight? Why explain a feeling if the other person was unlikely to understand it? Slowly, avoiding conflict became easier than resolving it. But easier didn't mean healthier. It simply allowed the distance between them to grow quietly. Daniel had spent years believing that if he kept moving forward, eventually the marriage would improve. Now something inside him was changing. He wasn't looking for another solution. He wasn't planning another attempt to repair the latest problem. For the first time, Daniel was beginning to stop trying to fix the marriage. And when a person stops looking for ways to repair the present, they often start doing something else instead. They start looking backward. Daniel began revisiting the decisions, conversations, and moments he had once dismissed. And somewhere in that history, he believed he might finally find the answer to one question that had followed him for years: when did their marriage actually begin to break? For years, Daniel had asked the same question in different ways: why are you unhappy? He had asked it after arguments, after quiet evenings, after another attempt to make life easier. But now, with the marriage feeling more distant than ever, he began asking something different. When did this actually begin? So Daniel started reconstructing the timeline in his mind. Before the move, there had been plans. They had both worked, both talked about the future, and both imagined that their lives would gradually improve. Then came the job offer. Daniel remembered the conversations, the questions, the uncertainty. He remembered asking Emily again and again whether she was willing to move. Eventually, they relocated. His income improved. Their financial pressure eased. But Emily's career never recovered the way either of them had hoped. At first, Daniel believed that was the source of everything. He tried to help her restart. Resumes. Job searches. LinkedIn. Domestic help. More freedom. More choices. But nothing seemed to change the resentment. Then came the arguments over the smallest things. The rules inside the house. The constant tension. The medical struggles. The growing distance between them. Looking backward, Daniel began to notice something he had overlooked for years. Emily hadn't simply become unhappy after one bad day. Something about her had changed during a particular period. But what had happened? Was it the move itself? Was it the feeling that her career had been taken from her? Was there something Daniel had said that he no longer remembered? Had Emily lost an opportunity she never told him about? Or had something happened during those early months in their new city that neither of them had ever properly confronted? The more Daniel reconstructed the past, the less certain he became about his own version of it. He had spent years believing he knew where the problem began. Now, for the first time, he wondered if he had been looking at the wrong moment entirely. Maybe the real question wasn't, "Why are you unhappy?" Maybe it was much more uncomfortable. When did you first become unhappy? By the time Daniel began looking at his marriage differently, he realized something important: Emily had not simply become unhappy after the move. She had lost something she had never learned how to replace. Before they left, Emily had a career, a professional network, and a sense of independence that existed outside their marriage. She had plans for herself. She had momentum. Then Daniel's opportunity came, and everything changed. She agreed to move, but agreeing to something and accepting its consequences are not always the same thing. Daniel remembered the conversations differently. He remembered asking again and again if she was comfortable. Emily remembered something else. She remembered knowing that if she refused, she might become the person standing between her husband and a better financial future. So she said yes. And that yes followed her into the new city. Daniel thought the problem was unemployment. Emily felt the problem was everything she had lost to get there. Every time Daniel offered another solution, he believed he was giving Emily a way forward. A new resume. A job listing. A maid. A cook. Financial security. Even the option to stay home. But Emily didn't experience those gestures in isolation. She experienced them through the memory of the life she believed she had surrendered. To Daniel, the message was simple: "I'm trying to help you." To Emily, the message sounded completely different: "I'm trying to fix what you did to me." And that difference changed everything. A practical solution could not repair an emotional wound that had never been acknowledged. Still, there was something Daniel couldn't explain. Losing a career could create resentment. Losing independence could create anger. But why did that anger appear in arguments about towels, household rules, and ordinary routines? Why did seemingly harmless moments carry so much weight? Daniel was beginning to understand the first layer of Emily's resentment. But the deeper layer was still hidden. Because somewhere between the move and the marriage they had now, something had changed inside Emily, and Daniel had never discovered what it was. And until he understood that, he would never understand why every attempt to make things better seemed to make them worse. For years, Daniel had believed the move was the beginning of Emily's unhappiness. But the deeper he looked, the more he realized that the move may have only been the moment when something already fragile finally broke. Before they left, Emily had been given an opportunity connected to her career, an opportunity that could have allowed her to remain professionally independent and continue building the life she had worked toward. It wasn't just another job. It represented momentum, identity, and the possibility of becoming someone outside the role of wife. Then Daniel's opportunity came along, and Emily faced a choice she never fully explained to him. She could stay and pursue her own path, or she could move with Daniel and support the future they had planned together. She chose the move. But what Daniel didn't know was what she believed that choice meant. Emily didn't see herself as simply agreeing to relocate. She believed she was making a sacrifice for her marriage. And there was something else she never told him. She expected Daniel to understand the size of that sacrifice without her having to explain it. She thought he would eventually notice what she had given up, recognize what it had cost her, and understand why she struggled afterward. But Daniel saw the situation differently. He remembered asking her repeatedly whether she wanted to move. He remembered waiting for a clear answer. And because she eventually came with him, he believed she had accepted the decision. In his mind, there was no sacrifice he needed to repay because, as far as he knew, they had made the choice together. That difference became the hidden fault line beneath their marriage. Emily thought, I gave something up for us. Daniel thought, we chose this together. Neither realized they were living inside two completely different versions of the same decision. That was why Daniel's attempts to help had never landed the way he intended. When he offered to prepare resumes, Emily didn't see encouragement. She saw a reminder of the career she had lost. When he offered to hire help around the house, he believed he was removing obstacles. Emily saw another attempt to solve a problem he didn't fully understand. And every time he asked why she wasn't moving forward, the question seemed to confirm what she already believed, that Daniel had never understood what she had sacrificed. But there was one uncomfortable truth still waiting for Daniel. Emily had never actually told him the full story. She had expected him to know something she had deliberately kept inside. And Daniel, for his part, had assumed that silence meant agreement. The marriage had been built around a misunderstanding neither person realized they were carrying. But if Emily had sacrificed her opportunity because she believed that was what a good wife was supposed to do, then Daniel had to face a difficult question. Had he unknowingly encouraged her to make that sacrifice, and then spent years blaming her for the consequences? For years, Daniel had asked the same question in 100 different ways. What was wrong with Emily? Why was she always unhappy? Why did every attempt to help seem to make things worse? But now, after reconstructing the past and realizing how differently they remembered the same events, Daniel finally asked the question he should have asked much earlier. When did you stop being happy with me? For a moment, Emily said nothing. She looked away, as though the answer had been sitting inside her for so long that saying it aloud might change everything. Then she began to speak. She told Daniel that the move had never felt as simple to her as it had to him. She had heard his questions. She knew he had asked whether she was comfortable leaving. But emotionally, she felt that the decision had already been made. His opportunity was too important. Their finances were too strained. Their future seemed to depend on it. So she went with him. And somewhere along the way, she convinced herself that giving up her own plans was what a devoted wife was supposed to do. Then came the part Daniel had never understood. After the move, every attempt he made to help her find another job reminded her of what she had lost. When he prepared resumes, he saw support. She saw the career she no longer had. When he searched for positions, he believed he was helping her rebuild. She felt as though he was trying to repair something without ever acknowledging how it had been broken. When he offered to hire a cook and a maid so she could focus entirely on her career, Daniel thought he was removing every obstacle in her way. Emily heard something else entirely. She heard, "You chose this." And every time Daniel asked why she wasn't moving forward, the resentment grew deeper. Daniel listened without interrupting. For once, he didn't defend himself. He didn't list everything he had done. He didn't explain how many times he had asked her before they moved. He simply listened. And slowly, something uncomfortable became clear. Daniel wasn't the villain he had feared he might be. But he wasn't the hero he had imagined himself to be either. He had genuinely tried to provide. He had genuinely tried to help. But he had also failed to understand the emotional cost of a decision he believed they had made together. Then Emily said something that changed the conversation completely. There was something Daniel still didn't know. Something she had done before leaving their old city. Something she had never told him because, at the time, she believed it was simply part of the sacrifice she was making for their marriage. Daniel had spent years believing he knew what Emily had given up. He was about to discover that he had never known the full story at all. The truth Daniel had been waiting years to understand was finally sitting in front of him. Shortly before their relocation, Emily had received an important career opportunity. It was the kind of opportunity that could have changed the direction of her professional life. She had seriously considered taking it. She had imagined what staying behind might mean, what it could do for her confidence, her independence, and the future she had been building for herself. But then Daniel's opportunity arrived. The salary was better. Their financial situation needed it. And Emily made a decision she believed a good wife was supposed to make. She turned the opportunity down and chose to move with Daniel. What made the revelation painful wasn't simply that she had sacrificed her career. It was that Daniel had never known she had made the sacrifice in the first place. Emily had never told him how important that opportunity had been. She had never explained how difficult it was to walk away. Somewhere inside her, she believed he should have understood without being told. Daniel remembered the situation completely differently. He remembered asking Emily whether she wanted to move. He remembered waiting for an answer. He remembered believing that they were choosing their future together. And because Emily never told him what she had given up, Daniel spent years interpreting her unhappiness as resentment and ingratitude. He thought he was doing everything possible to make their new life work. Emily saw those same efforts through an entirely different lens. Every resume he prepared reminded her of the career she had abandoned. Every job listing he sent reminded her that the opportunity she really wanted was already gone. Every practical solution felt like another attempt to fix the consequences without acknowledging the sacrifice that caused them. And suddenly, the phone incident made sense. Daniel had spent years believing that if he could simply provide enough, solve enough, and give enough, Emily would eventually become happy. But happiness was never what the phone could fix. That 76,000 phone had only exposed something that had been hidden for years. Daniel had been treating the symptoms while Emily had been carrying an old wound neither of them had properly confronted. The arguments over towels, the resentment, the silence, the failed attempts to restart her career, even the emotional distance between them, all of it had been connected to something that happened long before either of them understood its significance. For the first time, Daniel could see why his efforts had never been enough. He had been trying to repair a marriage without knowing what had originally damaged it. And Emily had been waiting for him to recognize a sacrifice she had never fully described. Two people had spent years living inside the same marriage while carrying completely different versions of its history. But there was still one question Daniel couldn't escape. If Emily had chosen to sacrifice her career for him, why had she never told him? And if she had told him the truth years earlier, could their entire marriage have turned out differently? And suddenly, the moment that started everything looked different. Daniel remembered standing in that store, choosing a new phone for Emily because her old one was failing. He had spent $76,000 on it because, in his mind, this was another small way of taking care of his wife. He expected at least a little excitement. Instead, Emily looked at the phone and said, "Why should there be excitement? I don't have a flip anymore anyway." At the time, Daniel heard something much simpler: "Nothing I do is ever enough." After everything he had provided, even a thoughtful gift seemed to become another source of disappointment. But now, knowing what Emily had been carrying for years, those same words could be heard differently. Perhaps she wasn't thinking about the phone at all. Perhaps she was thinking about every decision that had come before it. Another change. Another choice. Another situation where something was presented as better for her, while she was expected to accept it and be grateful. The phone hadn't created the resentment. It had simply exposed it. But understanding Emily's perspective didn't mean Daniel suddenly became responsible for everything that had gone wrong. Emily had made choices too. She had turned down an opportunity without fully explaining what it meant to her. She had expected Daniel to understand a sacrifice he didn't know she had made. And over the years, that unspoken resentment had shaped the way she treated him. The constant arguments, the hostility over ordinary things, and the emotional distance were real. Daniel had been hurt by them, and his pain didn't disappear simply because he now understood where some of Emily's anger came from. At the same time, Daniel had his own blind spots. He had spent years approaching emotional problems as though they were practical problems waiting for practical solutions. When Emily needed to be understood, he often tried to fix. When she needed acknowledgement, he offered logistics. When she needed someone to recognize what she had lost, he offered another opportunity. And that may have been the tragedy of their marriage. They had spent years fighting over the visible problems while avoiding the wound underneath them. The phone wasn't the beginning. The arguments weren't the beginning. Even the move wasn't necessarily the beginning. Somewhere beneath all of it was a sacrifice that was never properly discussed and a misunderstanding that grew stronger with every passing year. Daniel finally understood the wound. Emily finally understood that Daniel had never known the full story. But understanding a marriage's deepest problem doesn't automatically save it. Sometimes, discovering the truth is only the beginning of the hardest decision two people can make, deciding whether the damage can still be repaired. By this point, Daniel was no longer standing in the same place he had been when he bought that phone. Back then, he believed his responsibility was to keep trying. Find another solution. Work harder. Give more. Be more patient. But after hearing Emily's side of the story, something had changed. He finally understood that he couldn't spend the rest of his life trying to rescue someone from a pain they had never fully explained. At the same time, Emily was facing a difficult truth of her own. Her sacrifice had been real. Her disappointment had been real. But so was the damage her resentment had caused. Understanding where her anger came from did not erase the years of arguments, distance, and emotional exhaustion. If their marriage was going to survive, both of them would have to take responsibility for what they had contributed to it. And that left Daniel with a question he couldn't answer immediately. Should he stay? Could two people who had spent years misunderstanding each other actually rebuild what they had damaged? Could Emily learn to separate the loss of her old life from the person she had chosen to marry? Could Daniel learn that providing solutions wasn't the same as providing understanding? There were no easy answers waiting for them. The conversation had revealed the wound, but it hadn't healed it. The resentment hadn't disappeared simply because it finally had a name. The arguments hadn't been erased. The years they had lost couldn't simply be returned. For the first time, Daniel wasn't trying to force an outcome. He wasn't promising another solution or making another sacrifice in the hope that it would finally make Emily happy. And Emily, for the first time, had said aloud what she had carried silently for years. Whether that honesty would become the beginning of something new or simply explain why their marriage had reached its breaking point remained uncertain. They had finally found the truth behind the conflict. But truth alone doesn't tell two people what to do next. Sometimes it only puts the decision in their hands. And now, after years of trying to understand what went wrong, Daniel and Emily had to face the hardest question of all, was understanding each other enough to begin again. In the end, the phone was never really about the phone. The move was never the entire story. And the arguments over towels, household rules, careers, and everyday routines were never the real problem either. They were signs of something deeper that Daniel and Emily had spent years failing to understand. Daniel had believed that love meant providing solutions. If there was a problem, he would work harder, earn more, pay for treatment, find another opportunity, or remove another obstacle. Emily had needed something different. She had needed to feel that the sacrifice she made had been seen, understood, and valued. But neither of them understood the language the other was speaking. Daniel kept offering solutions while Emily kept carrying an unanswered question: did he ever understand what she gave up for their marriage? And perhaps that's what makes their story so difficult to judge. Daniel wasn't simply a selfish husband who refused to provide. Emily wasn't simply an ungrateful wife who complained about everything. Both had made choices. Both had remained silent at important moments. Both had interpreted the other's actions through their own pain. And over time, those misunderstandings became part of the marriage itself. Sometimes a marriage doesn't collapse because two people stop loving each other. Sometimes it begins collapsing because two people remember the same life differently, and spend years fighting over whose version is true. Daniel finally understood what Emily had sacrificed. Emily finally understood why Daniel never realized the full weight of it. But whether that understanding was enough to save them remained a question only they could answer. So now the question goes to you. If you were Daniel, could you forgive Emily after discovering what she had sacrificed in silence? Or would you feel that she should have told you years earlier, before resentment changed the way she saw everything? Tell us what you think in the comments. There may be no perfect answer, but your perspective could reveal something about how you see love, sacrifice, communication, and marriage. And if you want more real-life inspired stories about marriage, secrets, relationships, and the decisions that change people's lives, subscribe and stay with us for the next story.